Please welcome a legend to the building, and I do not use that word lightly. This guy is a trailblazer in the areas of journalism and hip hop publication, somebody who has cemented themselves in the history and the fabric of all things hip hop culture, the founder of the Hip Hop Bible, aka the Source Magazine. Please welcome to VladTV, Mr. Dave Mays. Dave, what's up, brother?
What's up, Prez, man? Good to see you. Happy to be here.
Good to see you, brother. Good to see you. Dave, so many people know you for this amazing publication that you created. But before we get into the details of that, I want to take it back a little bit. You're originally from DC, correct?
Yes, born and raised in Washington, D.C.
When we traditionally think about DC, we think Chocolate City. So was you from the heart of Chocolate City, or was you from the other side of town?
Well, I mean, a lot of people who say they're from D.C. end up really being from Maryland or Virginia. I grew up in the city, upper northwest part of D.C. So it was a nice neighborhood where I grew up in. But I went through the public schools there, and met a lot of people from all over the city that were coming into my school, from elementary to junior high to high school.
You mentioned that you went to public school, but I gotta believe you were exceptionally intelligent, because from a public school, you went to an Ivy League college. You went to Harvard. That ain't an easy school to get into.
Yeah, it definitely is a hard school to get into. Actually, being from a public school in a big city like DC was kind of a plus, because even back then Harvard was, trying to be kind of diverse as they could. So I checked the box on that in a sense. But yeah, I always had really good grades. I was a really good student. I was near the top of my class, but I also was involved in a lot of extracurricular activities that I think benefited me, in applying to Harvard. Like, I played basketball, I played tennis, I was, the editor of the newspaper for a year. Different things like that, I think all played a part in getting me accepted into Harvard.
What other schools were you accepted to? Or was Harvard always your top choice?
Actually, I only ended up applying to 3 schools, which was Harvard, Brown, and Penn. And I got accepted into all of them. I wanted to go to school in a big city on the East Coast, but, not stay in DC. And, I was in a position where, I was fortunate enough to be able to, have a chance to get into some of these Ivy League schools. So, that was always something in my family growing up that was encouraged. So, I was really excited. I picked Harvard because, it's right outside Boston. And, I thought that would be an interesting city for me to be around.
Boston back in those days was not necessarily known for hip hop. For you creating this magazine in Boston, where did your love for hip hop come from? Or did you just always have this affinity for hip hop?
Yeah, well, again, growing up in DC, I got kind of exposed at an early age just to kind of the music and the culture of the city, and really just took to that. As some of your viewers might know, in the 80s and beyond, go-go music was the dominant music in the inner city, in the DC area. So I was actually much more into go-go from a young age than hip hop. But we did get some of the big rap songs on the radio down there. So, when I was in 6th grade, I heard Rapper's Delight on the radio, and I would run around the playground, reciting all the lyrics. So I loved that song. But it was really the message. I remember hearing that on the radio in whatever that was, 82, 83. I'm in junior high. And that song really moved me, just, the emotions and the feelings and everything of that song. But, to be fair, again, I was much more into go-go throughout my junior high and high school years. When I got to Harvard, I had all my go-go tapes. Go-go wasn't on records. Go-go, you just had to have cassette tapes, that people would sell. You get in the stores or whatever from the live shows. So I had all my go-go tapes with me. But, when I got to Boston, it was a little different scene. People were not into go-go music at all up there.
In 1986, while at Harvard, you go on the college radio station WHRB and do a hip hop radio show. I know your partner was John Schechter. Did you meet John at the radio station, or were you guys cool before doing the radio show?
No, when I got to Harvard freshman year, first of all, it was really like a shell shock for me because I didn't realize the people there were going to be very, very different from the people, I was used to being around in DC, my friends and stuff like that. So it was a bit of a culture shock. But there was, in the building I was living in my dorm room, one day I'm coming back in from class and I hear some rap music coming out of one of the rooms. And I'm like, oh man, I wonder who's listening to rap music because, it wasn't too many people there. And so I knocked on the door and introduced myself, and that was John Schechter. And John was a kid from Philly who grew up loving hip hop and had actually worked at Power 99 radio as an intern while he was in high school, and was just a huge hip hop fan. So we just started kicking it and talking music, and he's turning me on to some of the new, rap records in the 80s, fall of 86. And I'm telling him about go-go. And he already had the idea to join the radio station at Harvard and try to get a show. So we ended up deciding, to go down there together and see if we could get a radio show. Harvard's radio station had a big signal, so it reached throughout the Boston area, but they were playing pretty much classical music all day long. That was the big genre for Harvard. But we were able to convince them to give us a late night weekend time slot. I think we started at 1 a.m. on Friday nights to do this show that we call Street Beat. And when Street Beat started in 86, I was playing go-go as part of the show along with hip hop, but people hated it. People would call in and just be like, man, turn that trash off. What is that music? Blah, 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 blah. So it was a losing battle. So I became much more, into hip hop at that point in 86. And, this was an interesting time, as you know, Prez, for hip hop. This is really when you could say the real emergence of the golden era is happening. Prior to 86, of course, we had Grandmaster Flash and Sugar Hill and Fat Boys and even Run DMC. But it wasn't until, Rakim comes out in 86 and Boogie Down Productions KRS-One, then you get Public Enemy and NWA and others, the following year. This is when hip hop is going to another level as far as just the lyricism, the consciousness, becoming just much more of a cultural, social movement amongst youth. So, I was fortunate to kind of get into hip hop right at the tip of that golden era. So, I fell in love with it even more at that point. And, it's been my life, ever since then.
That's a super dope story. The Source itself, it was birthed as a one-page newsletter just to help promote the show. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I liked the idea of joining the radio station was I found out that they could, as a college station, it was unique in that you could actually sell sponsorships. And they allowed the students who got into the sales department to make commission if you sold. So I had always been an entrepreneur, just finding different hustles when I was growing up. I had a lawn mowing business in junior high with, 80 clients and business cards and stuff like that. And I had actually done some phone sales the summer before I got to Harvard. I worked selling Time Life books in a big call room, and I was killing it. Like, I was really good at it. So, I started thinking, okay, I can go and do sales for the radio station, and this would be a way I can make some money. And so yeah, so when we started the show, it started to grow a pretty good audience because in '86 again, there's very little rap music on the radio anywhere in almost any city, and where you did find it would mostly be on college radio. Boston didn't even have any kind of R&B or urban station on FM. They had an AM station that was only on daylight hours, WIOD, so you rarely heard any rap music. So people had to find hip hop on the college stations there. So people found our show, and the audience kept growing and growing over the years. And this really, this became my first passion was the radio show because, like I was saying before, I didn't really fit in at Harvard with the people there. I made a few good friends over the years, but I was really looking to meet people from the Boston area, from outside the Harvard, walls, let's say. And the radio show was sort of a pathway into the community. And Boston had a huge, hip hop audience back then. Like you said, it may not have been known for hip hop, but there was a huge, fan base that loved hip hop. And Boston also was kind of different from a lot of East Coast cities in that it wasn't really, they obviously were influenced by New York because, Boston's like whatever, maybe a 3-hour drive or whatever from New York, but they weren't like totally East Coast, New York focused like most other cities on the East Coast were, meaning, music that was coming from West Coast, from Texas, Ghetto Boys, NWA, different, artists like that. And then, they were being played like on the streets in Boston, whereas you wouldn't have heard that music in those years in most other East Coast cities. So, that was really good for me too, because it exposed me to, the whole of what was going on with hip hop across the country. So I'm trying to sell sponsorships of the radio show, and I'm going out to local record stores and clothing stores, and I'll walk in and give them my sales pitch, and they basically would laugh at me and say, like, who's listening to a hip hop show on Harvard station? Like, they play classical music, and I'm like, tell them, hey, I got people that loyally tune in every weekend. They love the show. I got a big fan base. This is going to help you. And it's not working. So I came up with the idea of creating a mailing list of my listeners as a way to be able to prove my audience to local businesses. So I would go on the radio, every weekend and just keep saying, call in, now and join the Street Beat mailing list. And I would sit there all night and write down names and addresses. John Schechter was like wondering what was wrong with me. Like, why are you doing all this? He didn't understand. And, I would write them down, then go in the other room and type them into one of these big computers, that we had back in that time, and start creating a database of my listeners. And I got up to over 1,000 names and addresses of hip hop fans around the Boston area that were listening to the show. And at that point is when I came up with the idea for the source, which was, in answering all those phone calls every week, what I noticed is people wanted to know anything and everything they could find out about hip hop. They were, when is the new, Big Daddy Kane single coming out, or who produced, that new EPMD record, or, whatever the case may be. They just wanted to know anything they could find out. And, there really was nowhere to get information about hip hop back in those days. So that's really the spark when I'm like, okay, I can, use this mailing list, create a newsletter and sell ads on the back side of the newsletter and mail it out to everybody. So the Source started in the summer of 1988, I would stay up in Boston for the summers to keep the radio show going. A lot of college, shows would go off the air during the summertime. Kids would go back home or whatever. But I was so into it that I wanted to keep it going. So that summer is when I launched that first newsletter. I sold, I think, 4 ads on the back, 3 to local record stores in Boston, and actually Jive Records bought an ad on the very first newsletter of The Source. And these were like, $50, $75 for an ad. But to me, that was good. And so that was the inception of it. After that first one, John Schechter came back to school in the fall, a couple months later, and I had mailed him one of the newsletters. And when he came back, he was like, "Man, this is kind of cool. Like, maybe I can get involved." And that's when, I decided, hey, come on in, let's, be partners. And he sort of took a little more charge of the editorial side, and I was able to focus more on the business of trying to grow it from, a 1 page. The next one we put out was 6 pages, had a couple more ads in it. That was maybe, a couple months later in 88. And then the third one was in January of 89, and it was a 16-page booklet, all black and white. But it did, we did kind of format it like a magazine. Slick Rick was on the cover. And the first 2 issues were free. I would just mail them out for free to everybody on the list. By the third one, I'm like, okay, let me try putting this on the counter at the record stores and selling it. So I think it was, I put $1.25 price on that third issue, and went out. Found out like a lot of the record stores, they didn't sell magazines in the record store, so they didn't have any way to kind of hold the magazines on the counter. So I figured out I'd go out to like a Staples and buy these like little metal typing stands that you would use to hold papers up while you were typing, and those worked as a rack. And I would give those to each store. Here's a little rack, and here's your magazines, and that became a huge thing. I mean, very quickly, I saw the vision to, expand this around the country. I started calling up every mom and pop record store in every city from, Detroit to LA to New Orleans, Houston, Miami, wherever. And I would find out who the stores were. And I would just call them up and say, hey, I got this new, hip hop magazine, The Source, and I want to send you some on consignment. I'll ship you a box, 10, 20 copies. And, if it sells, then, you send me back a check and I'll send you the next issue. And that worked like crazy. I mean, I built up, over a few years, I built up well over 1,000 record stores selling The Source. And it would sell out like these, and these mom and pop record stores back in the day, they weren't like big stores. A lot of them were just little small kind of hole in the wall even type of stores, but they would sell 50, 100, 150 copies of The Source every month. And that again was just because fans just wanted information, and we were able to really start gathering a lot of good news and getting interviews and building relationships with back then mostly the independent record labels. Those were the ones really dominating hip hop. Your Def Jams, of course, your Jive Records, your Profile Records, your Select Records, Sleeping Bag Records, all these type of labels. Those are the ones that I was building relationships with, getting them to advertise, and also they would provide us with access to their artists and other things to support the magazine. And so it was growing, and somewhere around what it may be 89. Somebody gave me a book about Rolling Stone magazine, which I didn't know anything about. I really knew nothing about rock and roll music or what Rolling Stone was. But I read the book and learned about how this guy, Jan Winter, had created Rolling Stone as an underground newspaper for rock fans in the late 60s. And he grew this underground newspaper into the voice of his generation. And as you probably know, in the 70s and 80s, Rolling Stone became like the preeminent voice of popular culture. Like, they were big. And I saw, in reading the book, I also saw a lot of parallels between rock and roll and hip hop. Rock and roll was more than music. It had a social and political, movement associated with it. It was viewed by the mainstream society as, something that was terrible. This is corrupting the youth of America. We got to stop this rock and roll music. And, obviously rap, hip hop was going through the same type of thing. But I also noticed a major difference. I learned at the time that rock and roll was actually created by black folks in the 50s, Little Richard and all the other artists that really created rock, and that, through Elvis and then the Beatles and artists like that, rock and roll really became music for white people and white artists. And what I noticed with hip hop was, that hadn't been happening. You had Run DMC selling 5 million albums or whatever, and everybody, that was young was buying that album, whether you were white, black, rich, poor, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. If you were young, probably under 25 back then, chances are you loved hip hop. And so I really saw a vision from reading that book. I said, man, I'm going to create the Rolling Stone of the hip hop generation. And I think this can be bigger than Rolling Stone because hip hop appeals to everybody, not just one particular group of people. So that's really what set me even further on the path to growing this thing. Last couple years in college, I barely went to class. I was, so focused on this. This just combined, my entrepreneurial drive that I had always had with this music and this culture that I was in love with. And just, those two things together, it was everything to me. And, I figured I didn't have to go to class. I could just study for the finals and pass my classes. Harvard's a lot harder to get into than it is probably to get out of. So I was able to, graduate, but basically never went to class the last 2 years.
In 1990, you graduate and major in what? Was it government?
Yeah, I was a government major.
Okay. People know you and Ray Benzino as co-owners of The Source. How does a Harvard student even strike up a friendship with somebody like Ray Benzino? This was a guy who was from the streets. How do y'all paths even cross, not only to be business partners, but just friends?
Well, like I said, through the radio show, it gave me sort of this pathway out to the city and to the community. And that's what I was looking for, to, meet people and make friends with people that were more like the people that I was friends with in DC. But I think it was 87, I read somewhere that they had a Boston Music Awards, and there was a rap group that won for Best Rap Group, and it was the almighty RSO. And so I'm like, man, I gotta meet these guys, and I gotta try to get them to come up to my radio show and stuff like that. And I found out where they were performing one day, and I just went down there, and introduced myself, and that's how I met Benzino. That was his group. It was Benzino and like 5 or 6 other guys in the group, and him and his DJ who went by Def Jeff, we kind of became friends, and I would go and hang out with Jeff a lot, and some of his guys, they would pick me up at Harvard and take me down to the hood in Roxbury or Mattapan, Dorchester, and I get to hang out and just see what was going on out there in those areas. So as the friendship grew, they asked me to kind of help them, get their career going. They already were pressing up their own records and distributing their own records and stuff like that. But like a lot of groups from cities outside of New York, there wasn't a lot of opportunity. So I decided to help them try to get a record deal. And in 89, 90, I got them signed to Tommy Boy. They got a single deal on Tommy Boy. It was big. Shout out to Kevin Maxwell. He was a A&R man at Tommy Boy who signed them. And so that continued, as the Source was growing. That was my thing. I was doing the Source, and Benzino was focused on his music career and whatever else he was doing. But we stayed friends, and I kept helping them. I got them, a deal with Flavor Unit on their compilation, and eventually RCA Records, a few different deals. And when I graduated, I moved down to New York, set up, our first office on Lower Broadway in Houston for the Source. And I was just focused on that, but I would still stay in touch with him and Jeff and the guys and help them with their music career. And they would come down, every now and then to New York and stop by and check out what was going on with the Source. So it was a few years later when I actually went to Benzino and asked him to come in as my partner. I had, in addition to John Schechter, I had two other partners that joined while I was still at Harvard. There was during our senior year.
This is Ed Young, right? Ed and James?
Yeah, Ed Young and James Bernard joined and became partners. Ed worked with me on the business side. He actually had some experience working with a magazine on circulation and other business things. So, he became kind of like the associate publisher. And James worked closely with John Schechter on the editorial side. James was actually a Harvard law student at the time. And so in our senior year, we asked them to come in as partners, and so it was the four of us were partners in the Source, those first few years. But it was probably around 95, Schechter and James Bernard left the Source.
Hold on for a second. Before we go there, I got some other questions for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I'm just curious. You did a really good job describing getting this newsletter off the ground and taking it national as a newsletter. But how long did it take for the magazine, the actual publication that we have all grown up on, know, and love, to really blow, to turn into a full-fledged magazine? Did that happen while you were still in Boston, or did it blow when you guys came down to New York City?
I mean, it was a fairly fast but gradual process. So the last few issues that I did while I was still at Harvard, they were more pages. I don't know, probably 30, 40 pages. We added a glossy color cover to the magazine. The inside pages were still like the regular paper and black and white photos and everything, but it was looking more like a magazine, and it was being sold all over the country in all those record stores I was talking about. But it wasn't a big business yet. It was growing, and we all saw the potential. But, in the middle of senior year, I remember everyone was like, well, damn, what are we going to do? We're about to graduate. Like, what are we going to do next? And how are we going to, actually go from, we were all students. So like, we didn't have to pay ourselves a salary. We were, eating at the cafeteria, whatever, on campus all the time, that type of thing. So we didn't have a lot of expenses, but we knew if we were graduating, we were going to need to pay ourselves and rent an office and things like that. So I came up with the plan to go to a bunch of those labels I mentioned earlier who were really supporting the Source. And I went to Tommy Boy, I went to, I think, even Columbia Records and one or two others. And I told them, look, I want to sell you a year's worth of ads up front, and I need you to give me the money up front. I'm going to discount the rate for you. I'm going to give you, a special position, the back cover, the inside front cover, something like that. And they agreed. People wanted, in the music industry, they wanted to see the Source continue to grow because it becomes such a valuable outlet for the labels. They didn't have anywhere else to be able to promote their stuff. And so I raised.
Do you remember how much those ads sold for?
Yeah, well, I raised about $75,000 up front in my senior year. Maybe January, February. We graduated in June. So that was the capital that we had to move down to New York, set up a small office, and begin to start paying ourselves, some small salaries. And, it grew from there. So once we got to New York, was that summer of 1990 was the first magazine that was all glossy paper and all color photos throughout. I think Ice Cube was on the cover summer of 1990. So it was becoming more like a regular magazine, and it was getting thicker, and I was selling more and more ads, still almost all to record companies in those years. But I would say, between 90, 91, 92 is really when the Source, picked up more steam, became, really recognized as this, underground, but still national magazine. And it was around that time that Chuck D called it the Bible of hip hop, somewhere in those early 90s years when we got that name.
You mentioned this a couple of times, and even as we're speaking, I'm thinking, like, I know that there were other magazines out at the time, the Jets, the Ebonies, the Essence, but they weren't necessarily speaking to our audience. They wasn't speaking to the hip hop consumer. Was the Source not just the first to get it right, but the first publication that was actually speaking directly to the hip hop culture?
Yeah, I mean, the only other magazines of note that were really around were the Word Up and the Right On type of magazines, that had the big pictures and pull out posters and, what's Slick Rick's favorite food, or, that kind of content. It wasn't.
I kind of look at those as fanzines. Those are magazines you would go to if you wanted a pull out poster of your favorite star. But the Source came in different. The Source came in as a very authentic, incredible publication. Chuck D didn't call it the Bible of hip hop for no reason. It really was the place you wanted to go for the source of the information. And speaking of that, where did the name come from? Who came up with the name?
I came up with the name back in that kind of spring, summer of '88, as I was putting the plan together to create the newsletter. I had a red Jetta back then. That was my dream car growing up in DC, was to get a Jetta, because that's what all the hustlers were driving in DC back in the '80s. So I was finally able to get a Jetta. And anyways, I was riding around in the car through town or whatever, and I was listening to the new Boogie Down Productions album. And I think, I'm trying to remember if this is My Philosophy, whatever the album was that came out in spring of '88. You can look it up. But there's a song on there, I think it's You're Slipping, where KRS says something, you want to hear a fresh rhyme, you come to the Source.
Mm-hmm.
And that just stuck in my head, driving around listening to him. Like, oh, there it is. I'm going to call it the Source. And the name obviously stuck. But that's not a lot of people know that story. I've only told it a couple of times, where that name actually came from.
You launched this thing in '88, and by 1990, y'all are moving. All things considered, 24 months is not a long time to get any business, not just a magazine, but any business up off the ground and moving. And what I love about some of the things, because you guys were very, very creative, and you implemented some things into the magazine that just cemented it as the place that anybody should go to know what's really popping in hip hop. Like, Chuck D, again, I want to stick to that whole, the Bible of hip hop. And I thought it was just so creative how you guys implemented the rating system with the 5 mics. Who came up with that whole 5 mic rating system? And for that matter, do you remember who was the first artist to get 5 mics? And can you even name 5 artists that ever received 5 mics?
Okay, you hit me with the trivia. So, as the Source got going, John Schechter and James Bernard, began to put together a small team of writers and editors and contributors to the magazine. And these were all young people. We were all living and loving the culture of hip hop. It was our lives, and everybody was very passionate about it, and the Source was done in a way that it didn't talk down to its readers. We spoke to the people in a language, that they understood and from a point of view that they could relate to. And that's just because of, the people that we had involved. So I think the record reviews start in 1990. That summer of 1990, that Ice Cube issue I was talking about was the first issue where we rated albums. And I think we were rating singles back then. We came up with the 1 to 5 scale of rating, but it wasn't mics yet. If you have any of those old issues of The Source, you'll see it's like an exploding record image that was 1 to 5 of those. But we had the descriptions: 1, totally whack; 5, a hip hop classic. Those, we had that, and we had the 1 to 5. So, the first, I think in that summer 1990 issue, there may have been a couple albums that got 5 rating. America's Most Wanted from Ice Cube, I think, was one of those. And there was I think it was a BDP album or KRS-One album that also got a 5 rating in that issue. So I think those were the first. We came up with the mics and changed it to the mics somewhere around 91, maybe middle of 91. And I don't know who actually came up with that idea. It wasn't me. It might have been John Schechter or one of the other people working on the editorial side. Yeah, that's how it started. And there was a few other albums, that got 5 mics in those early years. Brand Nubian, their debut album, One for All, got 5 mics. Tribe Called Quest. I know Low End Theory got 5 mics, and I'm not sure, but maybe People's Instinctive Travels did. I have to double check that. But Tribe is, I believe, the only artist to ever get 2 5 mic albums, at least originally rated as 5 mics. And then one of the most famous ones, of course, was Nas, Illmatic, that got 5 mics because, that really had a huge impact on Nas' career. Nas, he had a buzz, as you probably remember. He had the Live at the Barbecue, and then he had the halftime and stuff like that. But, right before Illmatic dropped, he didn't have that level of buzz with some of the bigger artists that were out there. And, we gave it that 5 mics right when it dropped. We had to do these reviews back then. The cycle was different. You had to work 2-3 months in advance before things came out. So we were able to get advanced copies of albums, and we would, spend hours listening to them, debating them. As a group, the Mind Squad was the group of writers and editors that would get together regularly to listen.
How much input did you have in giving 5 mics, or 1 mic for that matter?
I didn't get I didn't get very involved in the ratings. I was so busy trying to build the business of the magazine. There was so much to do with the magazine. And then, of course, by 91, I'm already expanding my vision from magazine to brand to multimedia company. I went from saying I'm building the Rolling Stone of hip hop. By 91, I'm talking about I'm building the Time Warner of hip hop. And so, I really trusted the guys that were doing the editorial and generally let them, not just the guys and the women. We had some, really amazing women that were part of that original Mind Squad. Dream Hampton, who's gone on to do amazing things, and Kieran Mayo were both original editors at The Source and part of that Mind Squad. Kieran Mayo is now kind of reunited with me with Breakbeat, that I guess we'll talk about soon, the new network I just launched. And she has one of our first shows called Culturati that she's hosting. That's a really dope show. But so yeah, it was a group of people. But yeah, I rarely got involved. I mean, I kept my eye on what was going on, with the magazine and the content. And I had input, if I heard something that I thought was dope, I would bring it down, say, hey, let's check this out. We need to get them in the magazine, that type of thing. But I didn't spend a lot of time in those ratings meetings.
From an artist standpoint, that was the holy grail. Artists actually went into the booth. They pinned their albums with that 5 mic rating system in mind. But another thing that I thought that you guys did from a marketing standpoint that was just brilliant was you focused on unsigned talent. And you entitled it Unsigned Hype. Out of that Unsigned Hype column, it came people like the Notorious B.I.G., DMX, Mobb Deep, Eminem. Who was it that came up with that column? Because that column is arguably the most important column in the history of any hip hop publication. Was that something you guys actually expected to blow?
Well, yeah, Unsigned Hype is probably, it's a legendary column and probably arguably the most influential magazine column in history, in terms of the influence it had on the genre. It started in 1990 while we were still at Harvard. I think the first Unsigned Hype was in the spring of 1990. People started mailing in their demo tapes to us once we had the magazine distributing around the country. And, we had a mailing address that we would print in the masthead, and people started sending in their demo tapes to us. And I'm pretty sure it was John Schechter who came up with that original idea of Unsigned Hype. Matty C was already working with us as well. Matty C was a student at NYU at the time. And Matty's also from DC, and me and Matt had known each other a little bit back in DC, but he was a couple years younger than me. And but he knew some people at NYU that knew John Schechter and some of his friends. And so Matty and my man Reef, Rob Tulo, they were some of the first people working out of New York before we even moved down there for The Source and helping with that, Matty in particular with Unsigned Hype. And we're actually doing the first documentary series right now on Unsigned Hype and how it originated and all the impact it had. It's a 8-part documentary podcast series that I'm doing for my new network, Breakbeat. We're already in the middle of production on it. It's going to come out probably at the top of the year, but we're going to tell the whole backstory of that column, where it came from, how, you mentioned a few. I mean, Biggie, DMX, Eminem, Common, Mobb Deep, Capone and Nori, David Banner, Joel Santana, Jay Electronica. There's others. All of these artists got their start, in The Source, Unsigned Hype, and many of them we were basically got them their record deals. You know, of course, Biggie being one of the biggest stories. You know, I can remember in '92 we had just put Big in Unsigned Hype, and Matty did that. You know, I think Mr. C brought the demo tape up to Matt and played it for him at the Source, and you know, then Matt would run around the office playing it for everybody, getting their feedback, and you know, Matt he loved Big, and so he put him in Unsigned Hype, and maybe, you know, a few weeks later, a month later, is when I got a phone call from Puff, and you know, Puff was A&Ring at Uptown, and I had met Puff, you know, when he first started as an intern at Uptown back in probably '89, because even though I was in college, I would come down to New York every now and then. I would take trips down and bring down boxes of the magazines and go visit the record labels and, you know, poly with the different folks at the labels and stuff like that. So I can remember meeting Puff. You know, he had a little small desk in the interior office at Uptown in '89 when we first, you know, became friends. And but of course he had become very successful doing A&R, and they had just decided, I think Andre Harrell, rest in peace, had decided to give him an imprint deal for his label, and it was still under Uptown, but it was for Bad Boy, and so he was looking for artists, and you know, he mentioned it to me. He was like, you know, you guys have anybody? And I went down to Matty's office, first thing I did, and said, you know, what do you got? And he was like, man, this Big, you know, this Notorious B.I.G. is dope. And so Matt ended up bringing the tape up or sending the tape up to Puff. And I mean, literally a few weeks, maybe a month later, Big got signed. You know, the rest is history, so to speak.
That's super dope, man. Yo, that's super dope. Tyson Beckford did an interview with VladTV, and he actually credited the Source for giving him his start. It makes all the sense in the world that Notorious B.I.G., Eminem, Mobb Deep, they would be discovered by the Source. But Tyson Beckford? I get he's definitely part of the culture, but you don't necessarily think of high-end fashion when you think of the Source. You think of hip-hop. How did that happen?
Buddy of mine, Eric Lauren Council, who worked at Source Magazine at the time. They were the first ones. They were the first publication that ever gave me a job as a model.
Yeah, shout out to Tyson, man. I saw that interview and I was happy to hear him tell the story. Yeah, you know, obviously, you know, we recognize hip hop as a culture, you know, not just the music back in those early years. And so the magazine reflected that with coverage of different aspects of the culture, and fashion, you know, being one of them. So we started like a small fashion section in the Source. And so one of our very first fashion sections, there was an art director that worked at the Source named Eric Council, and I guess he was walking around somewhere in New York and noticed Tyson playing basketball on a basketball court and just approached him, was like, hey, you want to be in a photo shoot for the new fashion section of the Source? And that's how it happened. It came out. That was Tyson's first modeling job, and the rest is history with him as well. And you know, there were others too. I mean, Aaron Magruder, who created the Boondocks, I really kind of launched his career. That was me. I mean, Aaron started the Boondocks as a cartoon strip in the University of Maryland college newspaper. And I remember going home, this is in the mid 90s, going home to DC, and I think my mom had one of the newspapers. She was working at University of Maryland, and she had a newspaper, and I'm flipping through it, and I seen the Boondocks cartoon in there. I'm like, man, this is dope. And I contacted him, and you know, so the Boondocks ended up running in the Source every month for a year or two. This was before they got their cartoon strip in the newspapers and everything else that's happened with the Boondocks. So that's an example of another type of person whose career came through this, really got started through the source, and just yeah. And there's others, a lot of executives too, a lot of people that worked at the source, a lot of writers. You may be familiar with somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's very well known author and speaker. I mean, he was a Howard University student, and he was writing record reviews for the source. That was his first writing work. And there's many, many others who have gone on from either working at or writing or contributing to the source to do amazing things, still around, to this day.
With a lot of good, there's, always problems that come right along with it. You do an article on Ray Benzino and his group at the time, the Almighty RSO. And because of that article, some of your co-founders and editors at the magazine, they walk out because they felt as though you crossed those very lines that you shouldn't cross. And you showed favoritism to an artist. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, the full backstory needs to be told.
Go ahead.
By around 92, 93, the source, as we talked about, it's big now, and everybody's, talking about it, and we have a lot of influence. And some of the editors, in my opinion, the success was kind of going to their head, and we were kind of losing a little bit of what really made the source so successful in terms of just showing love and being passionate about the music and the culture. And what I mean is that there was a series of big artists who at one point earlier loved the source, and then they went to hating the source. So at 93, 92, 93, 94, you had Ice-T publicly dissing the source. You had Public Enemy made you can look it up, there's a whole music video they made where it depicts the S1Ws storming the offices of the Sauce magazine and, wrecking the offices of the magazine. Snoop, I think, went on Rap City and dissed the source, and Ice Cube dissed the source on Hand of the Dead Body. And, I would go down the hall to the editorial side and talk to some of these editors and say, man, look, because they were writing things that were inciting. Oh, Cypress Hill was a big one. Cypress Hill, we basically launched Cypress Hill. We really loved Cypress Hill when they first came out, helped big them up in the magazine all the time, really helped launch their career. But by the second or third album, they hated us because of shit that was being printed in the magazine and just the way it was being handled. So Cypress Hill was going around burning copies of the source on stage. And, basically a lot of these artists just felt that it was like personal kind of agendas and personal attacks. And, some of it might not have been, but some of it probably was. And I would go down and talk to the editors and say, look, this isn't what the source is about. It's not like we have to only say good things about everybody. We can be critical, but there's a way to be critical without making it personal. And I can remember saying, especially in hip hop, this is a music and a culture that comes from the hoods of America, where shit is fucked up, and there's a lot of, real things going on that people have to deal with living in these hoods in America. And these artists, this is their lives on the line, and you got to be sensitive to that. And, you just can't make it to, you can't make people feel like you have a personal agenda or personal attacks. And there was a lot of back and forth going on even publicly between some of the editors of the source and some of these artists. And to me, that was just bad business. I didn't want to be the National Enquirer. Yeah, you can be that if you want, and you can print all kinds of, incendiary things, but that wasn't what the source was about. So we were having differences, me and some of the editors. So we weren't seeing eye to eye, and they knew that Benzino and his group, were my friends, and when Almighty RSO got a deal with RCA Records, it was an EP deal, which was big. That was their first, beyond a single deal. And actually, Steve Stout was the A&R person. He had just got the job at RCA, his first job. I had met Steve. Steve used to come to the office with Kid and Play, and he would hang around the office, and he would just soak up everything going on, and we kind of became friends. And so when he got his A&R job, I brought him the Almighty RSO new project, and he signed it. So they had a big project coming out on a major label, and I went down the hallway a few times to the editors and said, hey, they got a deal, they got a project coming out, like, let's do a little something, let's give them a little one-page story or write a review of the album or whatever. And they were like, fuck no, we're not covering them, we don't like them, they suck, this, that, and the other. And to me, again, it was just personal because of the issues that I was having with them, and kind of the group became sort of the caught in the middle and the scapegoat, so to speak. So, I made a decision that, maybe I would do differently. But when they refused multiple times to do anything in the magazine, I decided I was going to put a story in and, not let them know about it. And I arranged the story and everything, and basically got it into the magazine without the editors knowing about it. And so, yeah, when that magazine came back to the office from the printer, I walked down to James Bernard's office, and I showed it to him, and I told him what I did. And, he went ballistic. He was just screaming at the top of his lungs. He was, how could you do this? This is, this is wrong. You're not supposed to be doing things that, the editors don't know about. And he just, he started this whole movement, him and a couple of other editors, started this whole movement, like, Dave Mays needs to resign. We would not work for the source. We're not going to turn in any work for the source until Dave Mays steps down as the publisher. Now, this is my magazine. Like, I started this, you know what I mean? Like, and so to me, it was like a power play where, again, like, they wanted me out of the picture because they wanted to try to keep doing the things they were doing. And I was trying to stop them, from doing some of the things they were doing. So that's how it started. But they rallied a lot of people behind it. And most of the editorial staff ended up walking out, and they got a petition of like 75 writers. And, James wrote this letter that got sent out to everyone in the music industry. It was like a 5-page letter, accusing me, oh, Dave is the group's manager. He only did this, for personal gain to make money. And, these guys are bad guys. They come up and smoke weed in the office, and, they've stole people's records and promotional T-shirts out of the office all the time and things like that. So, I mean, there probably were things like that did happen. I mean, not probably. I know that there was, because, guys would come down from Boston, and, they would come through the office, and, their man, it's his company, and they felt, they could just kind of walk around, and so they probably ruffled some feathers like that. That might have contributed, to the way the editors felt. So I can see both sides of it, but to demand that I resign just, to me, wasn't a reasonable way to resolve this issue. And
some of those guys went on to actually create the competition for the source, which was XXL magazine.
Yeah, James Bernard and a guy named Reggie Dennis, they were kind of the ringleaders of the uprising against me, so to speak. Reggie was a music editor at the time, and he was the one that was really getting into it with Cypress Hill and Ice-T and having all this back and forth, and just different stuff that was being printed in the magazine, just using language that you shouldn't use, things like that. But anyway, they eventually, a couple years later, were the ones who started XXL, with this magazine company, Harris Publishing. So when XXL comes out in '97, this is, a few years later, they were able to get that going. But yeah, they did start. They only lasted at XXL not even a year, maybe 6 months, and then they were let go, and Harris brought in new people.
Those are some of the editors that walk out. But where are your other co-founders at the time? Did they walk with them?
Well, James Bernard, who I've been talking about,
Yep.
he was one of the partners.
Correct.
So that's what
Yep.
made the situation a little more difficult. It wasn't like I could just fire him because he was my partner, and so I was trying to be, sensitive to that. So James was part of the walkout. John Schechter, he had already, before the walkout, John had been phasing himself out of the magazine that last year. He was getting a little disillusioned with things. He came to me and told me he didn't feel comfortable being white and being the editor. And I think, the staff, James and some of the other guys were kind of playing that up to him and making him uncomfortable. And he wanted to take a sabbatical. He wanted to take some time off and go write a book. So he was already, halfway out the door when everything exploded with the walkout. But he did side with them. He didn't stay and help. But the one partner, Ed Young, that we talked about, he's the one that stood by my side. Ed, like I said, he was a business person, practical, business-minded. He understood that, this could destroy everything we had built, because when that walkout happened, it made the news because of that letter that got sent out. It was crazy. Like a few days later, my mom is calling me, and the Washington Post had an article, greedy publisher, puts article in and editors walk out, whatever, making me look like this terrible person. And it was really damaging, could have been way more damaging. So Ed, he took my side and stood by me. And, basically we went out and hired new staff and replaced all the people that had walked out, and were able to keep the magazine on schedule. We got the next issue out that next month. Scarface was on the cover, another, a really dope cover of The Source. And we just kept it moving. And then, I brought in some other amazing people. A lot of those people were incredible, writers and editors, and they contributed a lot to making The Source successful in those early years.
Is this the time that Ray Benzino now comes in as a full partner?
Yes. So some point after all this happens and the dust is settled, he really kind of, stood by me. And, there was some drama that was going on, like, when they were walking out, they were making threats and different things like that. So, he came down from Boston with some guys and, just watched my back and stuff like that. And, sometime after all the dust settles, I just, now I only have one partner, which is Ed. And, I went to him and said, yeah, maybe you should come on board, and I want to, make you a partner and help me out. I think you can help me with different things with the magazine and, the awards and other things I was doing. And that's how that happened. That was probably, like I said, maybe 95 is when I brought him in. And yeah, that's how it
From
happened.
your standpoint, why bring him on as a partner? I know you were getting heat from, some of the editors that had left and your former partners, and also some of the artists around the hip hop industry. So bringing Benzino to the table as a partner, was this, because he had, real credibility in the streets? Was he your muscle? Did he have something else in his arsenal that you felt you needed at the time to really just help you move this publication forward? Why did you bring him on as a partner?
Yeah, no, it wasn't just the muscle part of it. Yeah, him and his crew were guys from the street, and, they definitely looked out for me over the years. But, Benzino was and is, a huge hip hop head. He grew up, on hip hop long before I got into hip hop. And that was his life. You know, he loved it. And so he, you know, he knew everything about hip hop, and he knew a lot about the streets. And, you know, that was important to the Source. You know, what made the Source successful from the beginning was, you know, being able to kind of represent the streets in a credible, authentic way, and balance between taking the company into the corporate world and helping bring hip hop more into the mainstream. You know, that's really the Source had so much to do with helping hip hop go from an underground music into this mainstream commercial industry. So having that balance, being able to walk that line, and not too many, I mean, really no companies, you know, walk that line, you know, no other magazines. And that's always what separated us from our competition, you know, Double XL, and even before them, you know, in the early 90s, there was Rap Pages, and then of course, Quincy Jones starts Vibe magazine. And, you know, some of those magazines had talented editors, but, you know, these were basically, you know, white-owned companies. You know, even Vibe was owned by Time Warner. You know, Quincy owned a piece with them, but you know, these were white-owned companies that, you know, honestly, I don't think gave a damn about hip hop, the streets, the people, the culture. They was just try to make money. They knew hip hop was growing, and so there was always a disconnect, you know, because I was the one that was covering all the bases from the business side. You know, I could walk in the room and deal with, you know, the advertising, the circulation, any business with any corporate person, and handle that. You know, of course, I have my Harvard, you know, degree and whatever, and that carries a lot of weight in those kind of circles. But, you know, I was able to also balance it by always keeping my connections to the streets and to the people, and understanding the pulse of what's going on in the streets is what is going to kind of dictate the direction of hip hop. So I think that was a large part of it. You know, the loyalty was part of it, you know, that, you know, he had been loyal to me and stuck by me through the shit I was going through. But it was also just, you know, that idea that, you know, having someone who's really connected to what's going on out there in the streets can be helpful to feeding ideas and stories and different things, you know, into the magazine.
But in 1995, you had an amazing moment that still, you know, is talked about to this day in the world of hip hop. Suge Knight in Death Row is in the building, and Suge makes the infamous statement, if you don't want an executive dancing in your music videos, come on over to Death Row. Where were you at the time that statement was made? And did you realize in real time the gravity and the enormity of that moment? Because that truly has become one of those moments in hip hop.
Well, okay, the Source Awards, I had started back in 91, you know, and it started as a day on Yo MTV Raps. You know, we were doing like a year-end wrap-up magazine issue, the Best of Hip Hop 91, and we came up with the idea to kind of put awards in the magazine, the best new artist, the best album, things like that. And, you know, nobody was recognizing hip hop. No award shows were doing anything. They would just play, you know, the hip hop community, or, you know, even the Grammys. They had a rap category, but, you know, the nominations in those years were awful. You know, the worst, nothing authentic. And the people that really deserved to be recognized weren't being recognized. So that was my original impetus for the Source Awards, you know, was let me create something where we can, you know, celebrate this amazing culture and recognize all these incredible people that are contributing to the culture, artists, producers, DJs, you know, other parts of the culture. And so I had the idea, like, I want to turn this into a real award show. So in 94, I was able to make that happen. I had brought in a guy named Mike Elliott to work with me, on helping develop the Source brand into other areas. And so he and I work really closely in developing and planning out the first Source Awards. So 94, we did it at the theater at Madison Square Garden with 5,000 people there. It wasn't televised, but I mean, it was an incredible night. And people, everyone from hip hop was there. Everyone was so excited. They couldn't believe it. They're like, damn, we got our own award show in this big ass theater. I mean, this is real. And, everyone from, Russell Simmons to Queen Latifah. I mean, Tupac was there. So there was a lot of excitement. And I was really able to do that because of the relationships I had built up with all these people, the Jay Princes and the Suge Knights and the Leor Cohens and all the people that were kind of making moves, running the big labels and stuff. And I went to them and said, hey, look, this is my vision of what I want to do. I think this is good for all of us. And they supported me. And that 95 show was the first televised show. So after the first one, we figured out, okay, we're going to try to get this on TV. And we figured out how to hire a syndicator to get it onto, the NBC station in New York and the Fox affiliate in Detroit or whatever. That's how syndication worked. And we had to pay them to get the show out to all these spots. And we had to, sell ads and stuff like that, sponsors. But I went to all the main label guys again. And it was like, this is even bigger now. We're going on TV. I really need everybody to come to the table. And you could see everybody did. Everyone was there that night. I will say that Suge was, really my biggest supporter in 95. If you recall that opening set, with the Death Row medley, everyone performed with the jail cells and all the explosions. I mean, he spent over $100,000 on the set alone, which, when you're producing an award show and you got a small budget, you can't afford to do stuff like that. So that helped bring the whole quality production level of the show up by a lot. And nobody else spent that kind of money on their sets. So I have to, say he was really a big factor in helping make that show happen so successfully. So as far as what happened, like, I was there, of course, at every Source Awards. I was, I put the whole show together. From who's performing, who's presenting, who's sitting where, and in the audience, all that. I was involved in managing all of those things. And anyone that ever knew me, like, you would never find me at any Source Awards, like, just sitting comfortably in the office, in the audience, watching the show. I was moving and running around from the backstage to the side to outside to in the theater and whatever, just trying to keep track and make sure everything was going smoothly. So I think when Suge went up and said what he said, I was in the back of the actual theater because I wanted to see, what was going on with the people. Like, it's 5,000 people, it was packed, and I just wanted to kind of, catch a vibe of what was going on out there in the audience. And I was standing in the back when he went on stage for that. And of course, when he said what he said, the audience, this is majority New York people that were there. The very front of the theater, those front sections, those were the industry, the labels and the artists and the people that were invited or whatever. And the rest of the theater, the other 4,000 people were people that bought tickets that were mostly from the New York area. So obviously, the crowd was pro New York and you can hear some of the boos and everything when he goes up there and says that. So immediately I'm like, man, I better get backstage and just, see what's going on, make sure everything's cool. And I can remember going back and on, the theater there, they have like stairs. There's a few different levels in the backstage of the theater there. And there's like stairs going up and down. And I can remember going up on one side of the stage and there was like, 50 Death Row guys running up and down, kind of like just rah-rah and just, through the back, through these stairs in the backstage. I went over to the other side of the stage, and that's where Puff was. And he had a bunch of people around him, and everybody was all, upset about it. And, people were upset. And, but to his credit, Puff took the high road. And, I talked to him, and he told me he was going to try to calm things down or whatever. And, he said some things to try to smooth things out. But, it was really Snoop when he went back up a little later and, went off on the crowd, y'all don't love us. Y'all don't love, Death Row and blah, blah, blah. That really helped turn the energy around in the room that night, because it was real. And, even though it was New York, people knew, people still listened to Snoop and Dre and, they were the biggest thing out at the time. So there was no denying that people loved their music, despite what had happened. So, the thing about that show, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it's been sort of mythologized over the years, and there's been a lot of misinformation, in my opinion, spread about it. I mean, there was no fights that night. It wasn't a punch thrown. Nobody got shot, stabbed, nothing like that. There was, some rah-rah, angry stuff, but everything ended up cool. Going into that show, this is August of 1995, there was nobody had any idea that Tupac was going to be getting out a month or so later and joining Death Row. Meaning, like, there was no beef going into that night. Death Row, Bad Boy, everybody was cool. And so it wasn't like, I was worried going into that night, like, oh man, there might be some problems or whatever. There was no idea that was the case. The beef, of course, had started with Pac and Big and Puff when he got shot in '94 and then went to jail, and he started, talking about it and pointing the finger at Puff and Big. And that's where the beef was between Tupac and them. But at the time, Death Row wasn't affiliated with Tupac. I'm sure probably Suge had been going to visit him and working on it, but nobody knew that. So, in my opinion, where things actually go left and things turn violent is a month or so later in Atlanta when Suge's man and my guy Jake Robles, I knew him really well. He was he worked for Death Row, and he was like, he was a dude from the streets, but he was doing promotions and he was sharp, and he was the one that got killed outside that Jermaine Dupri party in Atlanta. And that's when the beef becomes really serious and violent. I don't think that month or two after the Source Awards really was any real problems. Might have been some people's ruffled feathers a little bit behind what was said, but the whole thing that sets it off is that situation in Atlanta, and then everything gets, really, really serious from there.
Yeah, these moments have taken place far too often in hip hop, and they're the perfect storm setting off a chain of events for a bunch of things to come. But switch topics for a minute with me. GQ magazine. Everybody knows this magazine. It's an institution in American culture. For their 50th anniversary, they actually named The Source as one of the 27 things that changed men's lives over the last 50 years. Number one, did you know that type of recognition was coming? And two, how did it make you feel?
No, I had no idea. And I have that article framed
yeah, absolutely.
on my wall.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the top 27 things in the past 50 years that have changed men's lives. And, there was some pretty, we were in some pretty big company. So that was pretty dope. I had no idea. But it was a great, recognition to have.
By 2001, you were selling approximately 360,000 copies a month on newsstands. That's incredible for an independent publication. But as you know, with the law of nature, what goes up will eventually come down. And it was said that the source had a spending problem. You guys were making somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million annually in profits. But a lot of people started to ask questions, where are these profits going? And many people started to point the finger and say, hey, you, Dave Mays, was spending the profit on Ray's career. And there's one quote that you said that I love. You're like, no schmuck. I just spent $10 million on source.com. Dick face. Do you remember making that statement?
I mean, I was a lot younger. That was a long time ago. So I wouldn't speak like that anymore today. Yeah, I mean, you know, the truth of the matter is a couple things. The biggest contributor to the downfall of the source in the early 2000s was the gamble I took on the internet. You know, when the .com thing first came out in the mid to late 90s and started going crazy, you'll remember, like, you would turn on the TV and every commercial was for .com this, .com that. I mean, Wall Street was putting hundreds of millions and millions of dollars into all these .com things. And there was a bunch of hip hop .com companies that had raised, you know, Urban Box Office $200 million, and, you know, Hook.com raises $30 million, and all these different hip hop web businesses are raising huge amounts of money. Now, I was totally, once I learned more about the internet and what it was, I was like, man, this is incredible. Like, you know, this is a way for the source and myself to take what we're doing all over the world directly to the people. You know, the internet is a pathway to someone. You know, we didn't have smartphones back then, it was computers, but, you know, that someone can go on their computer, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in, you know, Asia, Australia, wherever they are, and they can consume information coming from us. And this was what got me so excited. I'm like, wow, this is going to be huge. This is going to be the future. And, you know, the source needs to be in on it. Now, in addition to what you were saying about all the money we had made and starting from, you know, a one-page newsletter, one of the things that I took a lot of pride in was, you know, I owned the company at that point 100%. You know, I never had any major backers. I never had any loans, investors. You know, any other hip hop entrepreneur from that era, they wouldn't have been able to generate the kind of money they did without having deals with these major record labels, which are these, you know, international corporations that are basically financing your business. And they take nothing away from them. There's some incredible accomplishments, but, you know, the source, I really built and owned and fully controlled everything about it at that time. So I took a lot of pride in that, and it was important because, you know, I felt like hip hop needed to have this voice that continued to be independently owned, that wasn't owned by some big company and watering down the message. And so I had people that approached me about investing in the .com or licensing the source to do the source.com. But I learned that I could take out this big loan, which I'd never done before. I didn't know anything about. And I'm like, you know, I learned I could basically bet the magazine company, mortgage the magazine company, and get $12 million. And that's what I did. I took it.
Let me ask you this. At some point, you guys sold an equity stake in the magazine to Black Enterprise. Is this before or after you take that loan?
This is after. Yeah, this is after. I take out the
Okay.
$12 million loan. This is probably 99. And, you know, that was more money. We weren't making probably 10 million. Our profit might have been 6 or 7 million a year. But, you know, with a business, you know, cash flow is always still an issue because the money's coming in, it's going out, you're expanding, you're putting money into other things. So it wasn't like I was just sitting on millions and millions of dollars, you know, at the time in the bank. So getting this $12 million loan, that was the most money I had at my disposal at any time. And I was like, wow, this is great. I do this loan, they wire me $12 million and I'm off to the races. I'm gonna go kill this thing with the .com. And that's, you know, what I tried to do. I opened up new offices, I hired new staff. We had all these big plans for the source.com. But we were just too early. You know, many .com businesses in those years came and went, failed. Hundreds of millions of dollars got lost on all kinds of .com companies. And, you know, I got caught up in that. And that was like, you know, an area that I didn't understand. I went to Harvard, but as we talked about, I studied government. I wasn't in business school. I didn't know about bank loans and private equity funds and, you know, warrant fees and all this stuff. And, you know, when you have a lot of success at a young age like I did, you know, I started the Source when I was 19. And so at this time in 99, I'm now 30. The company's, you know, incredibly successful. And so you kind of feel like, you know everything and you know, you're not gonna, you know, everything's gonna work. And I took a gamble that in retrospect, I shouldn't have taken. You know, I wanted to own the .com and not have a 50% partner or something like that. And, you know, I wanted to maintain that ownership. So I bet on myself, but it was a bad bet. I lost. And in a year or two, a lot of that money was gone. I mean, opening new offices, new staff, paying all these technology companies that were hustling everybody, you know, to pay them all these huge amounts to build websites. You know, you didn't know, you know, you don't know about that stuff. And so, you know, yeah, did I continue to spend money on Benzino and his music and some of those things? Yeah, some money was spent. But you know, the .com gamble didn't work, and in a year or two, I was in a bad spot. For the first time, I'm like trying to keep up with these, you know, $700,000 a month, you know, loan payments or whatever they were, and you know, if you don't make your payment, then there's a warrant fee. You owe an extra $2 million now, and all this kind of shit. And that was really when I had to go for the first time now and find a real investor. And that's when I ended up bringing in Black Enterprise. They had a private equity fund that invested $12 million for 18% of the business. And again, to me, that seemed like a great deal. I still own 82% of the company. You know, they helped me. Not only did they put the 12 million in, but they also brought me to a bank that refinanced that loan. That 12 million, I owed maybe 15 million on it right now, that point. So they got me a deal with the bank that gave us, you know, 17 million or whatever. We paid the 15 off, had a little extra to build the company back up. And that's what they told me. They were like, you know, we love your vision, we love what you're doing, and, you know, go out there and take over the world. And, you know, and we got more money. And, you know, the fund was like a $94 million private equity fund. And they're like, you know, we got more money in the kitty. If you need any more money, come on back. But again, I was naive about this stuff. You know, I didn't understand that that's kind of the way private equity firms get you is, you know, they try to get you to, you know, spend the money and have to come back to them. And that's kind of really what happened. That was really the final blow was, you know, I went out and I built the Source back up. You know, not like we had fallen off, but like we didn't do the Source Awards in 2002. I had to skip a year because of all the financial things that were going on, but I brought it back in 2003. I got it on BET. It was huge. It was the highest, you know, 6th highest rated show in BET's history. I had all these other things that were starting to pop. And but when I needed a little more money, I thought I could go back and, okay, if you got 18% for 12 million, well, give me another million. I'll give you 10%. Even if I have to give you 10, I still, you still only have 28% to get there. But that wasn't how they wanted to do it. They were like, if you need more money, we want to have 51% and you're going to work for us. Basically what I was told. And I wasn't going for that. And that became the source of conflict that eventually resulted in kind of the implosion of the company a few years later. And there was a lot of other things going on, Prez, as well. Back then, I mean, we were being investigated by the FBI for years back then in the late 90s and early 2000s. And, that was going on with a lot of hip hop companies, if you remember. I mean, the government and the FBI have been, messing with hip hop since they sent the letter to Priority Records about NWA's Fuck the Police back in 80, 88, 89. And, I believe that, the government looked at hip hop as something that was like a black power movement, similar to, the movements in the 60s with the Black Panthers and, and others, Malcolm X. And, we see what happened to those people. They just straight murdered, Fred Hampton and, things like that to destroy these movements. And even in recent years, this has been in the news in recent years about how the government is targeting, black radical organizations that, they're undermining COINTELPRO kind of stuff. That's what they did, in the 60s, COINTELPRO. They go in and they go behind the scenes and they meddle with shit and they get people to, flip and they get people to start beefs and drama and hype shit up. And, to me, that's something that had been going on in hip hop for a long time, something that has a lot to do with Biggie and Pac being killed. People don't talk about this stuff, but by the late 90s, Murder Inc., they get indicted. Little Kim goes to jail behind the FBI investigating. Yeah, okay, it was a shooting outside of a radio station. It's a bad thing, but is the FBI supposed to be like investigating? It wasn't like 81 people were murdered out there or something. It was a shooting. Nobody got killed. But, the FBI is putting, all their resources to try to get, put Little Kim in jail for that. Fat Joe had a bunch of tax problems and some of the people haven't talked about, but I know all the black companies, No Limit, Rough Riders, Rap-A-Lot, had their problem going on with the DEA. And so I believe there was a concerted effort to try to undermine a lot of these black-owned and independently owned companies. And I think, the source got caught up in that. So during those same years, the FBI is running around, knocking on people's doors like, hey, you're doing business with the source? Or did you know that, this guy is allegedly, did this back in 1989 in Boston or things like that? Like, it was crazy. So that's another thing that I think, hurt us that doesn't get talked about.
Nah, absolutely. And this is my first time really hearing that side of the story. I had no idea that the feds was meddling in your affairs and trying to bring you guys down. But one of the stories that is more commonly known about the source coming down is Ray Benzino going back and forth with a flurry of diss tapes against Eminem, and then the source releasing, which is now, commonly referred to as the racist tapes by Eminem. Looking back, you guys releasing those racist tapes as a publication, it damaged your credibility, but it also created enemies with some of the most powerful people in hip hop. If you have problems with Eminem, obviously you have problems with Dr. Dre. You have problems with Snoop Dogg, Jimmy Iovine, Interscope Records. At one point, you guys had an avalanche of problems coming down the hill at you. Do you look at this and say to yourself, well, if this was today, I would do things different. Maybe I would give those tapes to another publication, because Benzino being a partner in the most credible publication representing hip hop and an artist going back and forth with another artist, that's just a conflict of interest by itself. And then to release those tapes, now you're making enemies out of some of the biggest names in hip hop. So it puts everything that you work for in the source in jeopardy. Would you make that same decision now?
Yeah, well, first of all, like you said, this is something that may be more popularly known and talked about through the media over the years, as opposed to the stuff I just broke down that was all real and was all much more of a factor. The fact of the matter is, yeah, Interscope pulled all their advertising, but in those years, record company advertising was a fraction of our revenue. You know, in the early days, it was all our revenue, but by then, you know, we had Ford and McDonald's and Coca-Cola. We had everybody advertising in the source in 2000s. So Interscope pulling out their advertising didn't have any impact on the company financially. And that's a story that's been pushed, a narrative that's been pushed when that whole thing unfolded, you know. So I want to clear that up first. So, you know, I never felt like financially it was going to be an issue. You know, I think with the Eminem situation, it started because Benzino felt when the movie 8 Mile came out. And let me back up and say this. The Source discovered Eminem, okay? The Source had Eminem in Unsigned Hype. Eminem is the first white person ever on the cover of The Source. Eminem wins Lyricist of the Year at the Source Awards in '99 over some heavy competition. You know, we helped launch Eminem's career and we supported Eminem for those first few years. But by 2002, I think, is when 8 Mile is coming out. And this is when the media goes into kind of overdrive, the mainstream media. And it's like, you know, Eminem is the king of hip hop. You know, he's the greatest to ever do it. You know, they're just, you know, going crazy with, you know, the way they're portraying him. And I think that, you know, rubbed Benzino the wrong way. And I think it had him thinking like, you know, this could be bad for hip hop, you know, that just like Elvis was used to change the trajectory of rock and roll music and cut out black folks, you know, and then you're seeing, remember again what I was just talking about, all these black-owned companies being targeted and wiped out. You know, these are companies, these Rough Riders, these Rockefellers, these No Limits and Cash Moneys. They got, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of employees that they have on payroll, guys, you know, many of whom just got home from jail and wouldn't have gotten a job anywhere else. I mean, they were really impacting people's lives and communities and families that have been dealing with, you know, generational poverty forever. And these black companies that were flourishing in the late 90s, you know, did a lot to begin to try to turn some of that around. But you blink, and by 2004, they're gone. If they exist, they're just an imprint where you have one person up at Interscope that's in charge of Bad Boy or whatever, but there's no big offices and 50 people on staff anymore, any of that stuff. All that gets wiped out. And again, that's partly from the FBI, that's partly the music industry kind of using the internet and its impact on sales as a kind of excuse or rationale to wipe these companies out, et cetera. So we're in the midst of all that. And then this Eminem thing is going crazy. So I think it just got it. He saw that and he just felt like this is bad, and he made like a diss on a mixtape, a little 8-line diss, nothing on a mixtape that hardly went out anywhere. In a matter of weeks after the mixtape got put out, we start getting phone calls. Eminem's in the studio. He's already made 3 records dissing The Source and dissing Dave and dissing Benzino, and they're going crazy, whatever. And what I will say is I think it became personal, and it wasn't meant to be personal. The issue was not about Eminem per se at the time, because when it starts, those racist tapes don't exist. Nobody knows about those. We don't know about them. Nobody knows about those. Those only surface a year down the line after the back and forth. Eminem comes out with songs dissing The Source. Benzino makes songs and videos dissing Eminem and going back and forth. And, and the magazine kind of, reports on this stuff and probably, obviously took our side. So I think it getting personal wasn't the right way to handle it, at least through the pages of the magazine. But I always felt like, we were doing this for other reasons. Like we were trying to get a point about other things that ended up, kind of getting lost. And then a year down the line, these 3 white kids from Detroit drive from Detroit and show up in my lobby, and they're sitting out there for a couple hours, and waiting to try to get to see me. And finally, I get the message, and I bring them in, and they play me some of this music, the racist rap hour, that Eminem and his group at the time, it was 3 other white guys, had made this whole tape with a lot of racist stuff on it. And, of course, that was shocking to hear. So, I mean, at that point, we had an obligation to, as a magazine, as a journalistic, entity, to report about that and put it out there. There was some negotiations behind the scenes with Interscope trying to shut it down and trying to get us not to put them out and bury them so nobody would know about it. But those didn't go anywhere, and we published the information. They sued us to try to stop us from putting it out in federal court, and we won a landmark copyright ruling where the judge allowed us to put out only a very small portion of the tape under what's called fair use law. But so a lot of the stuff that was on that tape never got out, and so on. So, in retrospect, I think it got personal, and I shouldn't have allowed the magazine to at least give an appearance of taking, a personal kind of agenda. This is the thing that I was talking about earlier that I didn't like that was happening at the Source years before. Yeah, I mean, I think, Benzino obviously was angry as the disses and things, he took it very personally, and so things got a little bit crazy. And yeah, I wish it hadn't gone that way.
When Benzino went to war with Eminem, your COO at the time, Jeremy Miller, he's quoted as saying the magazine went from selling something like 380,000 copies a month on the newsstands to 270,000 copies a month. And that was in less than a year. So that's a huge decrease in revenue for the magazine. Now, granted, like you said, you guys had long moved on from record labels being your primary source of revenue. We get it. You were doing business with McDonald's and many corporate brands out there. But looking back, you spent so much time not only working for monetary revenue, but there's a credibility that comes with the fan base that you built over years and years of sweat equity. And now you're seeing that fan base leave. So Benzino going back and forth with Eminem, not only did it take a financial toll on the company at the newsstands, you're seeing a lot of the fan base go. You, as the founder, you're in the same position that many of the editors you accused years ago, where they were taking sides against artists. And you felt so strong that there was no place for that in this publication. And you're right there in the same predicament that you had once gone to war with people who were editors at your magazine. Is this something in hindsight that you would change? Was this a huge mistake on behalf of yourself and Benzino? Would you change it if you had the chance?
Yeah, again, I mean, that quote and those statistics from Jeremy, and Jeremy's my guy. I got love for Jeremy. He started, as an intern in 1991 and, became the CEO of the company after I left. But I'm not sure that those numbers are completely accurate. Also, I don't think you could attribute the decline in newsstand sales strictly to, the situation with Eminem. Again, this is the .com era is thriving. Magazine sales are declining. There's other factors. So the point really I'm saying is that's not the thing that caused the downfall financially of the Source. The stuff I talked about before, in my opinion, those are the things that were the more significant factors. So if I had to change anything, it would probably be taking out that $12 million loan and gambling on the .com. That's what I fucked up. If I hadn't done that, I think things would have been different, even coming through the Eminem situation, because we were coming out of that. We were getting behind, and we were still, Source Awards were still happening. We were still getting tons of advertising. People still loved the Source. I think, a lot of these narratives also come from people in the music industry and the media industry. I don't believe a lot of these narratives come from the fans, the people in, Chicago that went and bought the Source every month at their local record store year after year after year, or the people, in whatever, in Houston, whatever. I think as far as fans go, I don't think the narrative comes from them. This was a big thing in the music industry. Interscope and Universal Music controlled almost 80% of all the hip hop being sold at that time. Everybody was on Universal or Interscope's payroll. Everybody was getting money and dependent on them, no matter whether you worked at a label, worked at a radio station, worked wherever, you were getting money out of Universal because they were paying people whatever, payola. You know all the things that go on in the music industry. So a lot of people either didn't say nothing or took that side. But there's a lot of people that I believe respected, the Source's position on these things, but just were too scared to speak out and support us, and because it would have impacted their livelihood. And that's understandable. I don't blame anybody for that, but that's just the reality of what the situation was.
Things continued to be very rocky for you over at the Source. Your editor-in-chief, and I believe she was the first female editor-in-chief over at the Source, Miss Kim Osario, she brings a lawsuit against yourself and Ray Benzino. And in this lawsuit, among other things, you guys are sued for discrimination, sexual harassment, wrongful termination. And at the time, this was a landmark case. This is long before the Me Too movement, long before any of these women's groups that are out here now. Kim was on the front line doing something that was pretty much unprecedented, which was taking her case to court. Now, to your credit, the sexual harassment part of the case was thrown out, and you guys eventually did lose on the wrongful termination side. But would you say that this was the final nail in the coffin for the Source?
No, not at all. I mean, I wouldn't call it a landmark case by any means. I mean,
To be fair, yes, the sexual harassment part of her suit was dismissed. So congratulations on that. But during those times, women didn't take their employers to court. There were a lot of things happening in the workplace, but it was just accepted, whether it was inappropriate or not. These were just the conditions that women dealt with. So her taking that stance at that time, and she had a lot of women who didn't necessarily support her. I would say absolutely that was pretty landmark on her side. No?
well, yeah, but that implies that there was some validity to the claims that were made, which there wasn't. You know, first of all, you know, let's make this clear. Misogyny has been a part of hip hop for a long time. Calling women out their names and other things that have been in rap songs. That's an issue that hip hop as a culture really still has to deal with today. It's still an issue. At the Source, you know, I gave opportunities to a lot of great women and empowered a lot of great women. Some of the top executives, including Kim Osario, were women. And when that case happened, none of the other women joined her. There was one kind of marginal person that did join her, and she ended up phasing out because there was no basis for the case. But all the other top women, vice presidents and heads of other departments, you know, took our side and testified to that fact. You know, there wasn't some crazy, terrible exploitation of women going on at the Source offices. You know, that case was handled by a lawyer that saw that opportunity, in my opinion, to play that kind of narrative because of the existence of misogyny and the existence of the larger public perception of hip hop being something that was not, kind to women or supportive of women. You know, there was a lot of people outside of hip hop, the wider public, that had and still have a lot of negative stereotypes that they associate with hip hop. And some of them obviously have a basis, but, you know, some of them do not, and some of them are just over exaggerated. So, you know, we had insurance that covered us. It didn't cost us a dime, that case. As you said, the substantial charges were dismissed. The wrongful termination, to explain how that works in law, if somebody, an employee at a company, comes to the company and makes a complaint of some kind of discrimination, the company has an obligation to investigate that complaint before they take any actions. And that was where I made a mistake, because, you know, we were getting rid of Kim as an editor. That was happening for other reasons. There was a lot of things going on that caused us to make that decision. She had done an amazing job for a number of years, the first female editor of The Source. You know, I don't want to take that away from Kim. But the company had made a decision to make a change in the editor-in-chief position. And she found out about it before we were able to take that action. And the moment she found out about it is when, miraculously, all of a sudden, a complaint appears out of nowhere. Had never been one complaint ever before about anything even remotely along those lines.
In 2006, you and Ray are forced out of the company. At some point, the Source was valued at over $50 million. You guys are forced out of the company, and the artist formerly known as Prince, lawyer Mr. Londell McMillan, he comes in and buys the company for just under $4 million. So, sitting in your seat today, do you look back and revel in the sense of, you know what, I built this amazing company, and without me sitting at the helm, it lost major value? Or do you say to yourself, damn, had I just made some different choices, maybe I'd still be at the head of that company and the Source would be relevant today? Because all things considered, this is a company that went from your dorm room to being valued at over $50 million to being sold for less than $4 to arguably not being relevant in the world of hip hop. How does that make you feel?
Well, I try to live my life without regrets. And, I went through a lot in those last 5-6 years that I was at the Source, all the things that, many of which we've talked about here. Like I was saying earlier, the final straw was this private equity situation with Black Enterprise, because when they refused to put another dollar into the company, it was basically a stalemate, where I wasn't going to agree to work for them and let them have control of the company. I didn't want that. To me, it wouldn't have been in the best interest of the Source. And in some ways, you can look and see what happened to the Source without me, being the one running it. I'm proud of what I did with the Source. And I think what's important to me is getting the truth out about myself, about the history of the Source, and the history of hip hop, because I was a big part of everything that happened in the evolution of hip hop from the late 80s through the early 2000s to bringing it to where it is today. This world where hip hop is part of everything, every facet of our society. This is what I was envisioning when I was creating the Source in the early years. This is what I saw we would get to, a world like this. There's just really one main part that I think has got lost along the way, which is, the kind of social and political influence of hip hop. So, I'm actually, this is a good segue into what I'm doing now, because I feel like what I was doing and where I was going with the Source at the time, nobody has sort of picked up that mantle and run with it in the last 15 years. And that there's really a void here in the market for a platform that can represent the point of view of the hip hop community authentically across a comprehensive range of subject matters. The Source, as you know, was the magazine of hip hop, music, culture, and politics. So, you found fashion, you found health information, you found, business information. It wasn't just music, it covered the world, but from the point of view of the hip hop community. And I believe, that all of us who've grown up with hip hop from a young age, no matter how old we are today, no matter where we're from, white, black, Chinese, hip hop influences our way of thinking and our way of looking at the world. And, on a musical level, there's differences. And that's been, in my opinion, a narrative pushed by the music industry. The older people like us might be, I don't say this, but people say, oh, this music out now, this isn't real hip hop, this mumble rap isn't real hip hop, blah, 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 blah. The younger people, oh, you guys are just old and out of touch. So through the music, the differences across the generations are being highlighted. But what I see is, if you go beneath the surface of the music, and hip hop is much deeper than music. When you look at the way let's say someone who's 21 today and someone who's 48 today, they may not like the same music anymore. But in terms of the way they look at anything, news, politics, health, social justice, anything, sports even, the way we consume sports, I believe as a hip hop community, we have a certain way of looking at things and doing things that's different from everyone else. There's a lot of us that grew up on hip hop, but there's still tons of people out there of all ages that didn't grow up on hip hop and have a different mentality. And so what I'm creating today with Breakbeat, I believe, has the potential to be bigger than the source ever was. Hip hop is obviously bigger than it's ever been before, globally in every aspect. But yet, like I said, there's not a platform, a media outlet, a brand that speaks to the hip hop community, represents their perspective on all these things in our lives and our worlds that really matter beyond the music. And that's what's being overlooked. Nobody's really recognized that, I believe. And that's why I think Breakbeat can attract an audience from 15 to 55. They're not going to like everything the same, but there's going to be a lot of stuff we're doing with Breakbeat that somebody younger and somebody older is going to be intrigued by, is going to open their minds to say, oh, wow, I was thinking that same thing and nobody ever talks about that. And, that's what I see is missing out here. And so, Breakbeat has been launched as a podcast network. Podcasting is an incredibly, dynamic, fast-growing, and influential medium. And it's been around a while, but it's clearly going through a explosive growth phase. I believe it's something that's going to be around for a long time. I believe that podcasting is, sort of the new television, the new radio, the new magazines, all that is kind of rolled up into this podcasting world that's still growing and emerging. And while there are some great hip hop podcasts, and they all are some of the highest rated podcasts out, we're still only scratching the surface of hip hop's sort of infusion into the world of podcasting in many different ways, covering many different subjects. Podcasting is a medium that brings new voices, new perspectives, things you don't hear or see in the mainstream media are coming out through podcasting. So I've put together a collection of shows and hosts and programs that I think represents, this comprehensive way and these voices. So for example, the first podcast we've launched is Don't Call Me White Girl. She's an incredible talent. This is a woman, if you might have seen on $1 Million Worth of Game last year. She was on for several months as a co-host. She killed it on there. She's the one behind the "Why You Being Weird to Me" craze that's been going on social media. Probably one of the biggest viral moments of the year. That's her. And she's got a mixture that I think speaks to the DNA of breakbeat and what we really need in hip hop from a media standpoint, which is, you know, she's from the hood. She has a street sensibility, but she's really smart. She's going to make you think. She's going to talk about important issues while she's entertaining you, because she's funny as shit. She's hilarious, but she's also going to open your mind up. I think she's one of the people I'm calling my unsigned hype of breakbeat. Another one is Funny Marco. Funny Marco, probably everybody follows him already on Instagram. You know, hilarious dude, built up a huge following on his own these past few years. But I see, you know, talent in him that can take him to a whole nother level of his career. And so we're you know, producing a podcast with him that we're going to drop in the next few weeks that I think is going to be very successful. And then we're doing highly produced audio journalism. That's a side of podcasting that's enormous and has exploded in the past 5 years or so. But there's almost no representation of hip hop in that part of the podcasting business. So, for example, I have two big podcast documentaries that were in production on. One, I believe I talked about earlier, which is the story of the Unsigned Hype column in an 8-part series. The other one that I think is going to be groundbreaking and extremely important is the Larry Hoover story. And I'm out here in Chicago. I've been out here all year, in part because I'm working on that story with his family. It's the first time that the family has ever participated in the telling of his story. And most people only know Larry Hoover as, you know, the head of the Gangster Disciples, and, you know, you'll see him on, you know, America's Top Criminals series or whatever. But he has an incredible story that's way, way more important and deeper than that. He's the only kind of black gangster from our culture ever that transformed from that and was focused on politics. You know, a lot of people remember him on the Ghetto Boys Resurrection album, where he's speaking from prison before he got convicted federally. And he's talking about the importance of voting and the importance of people in our communities in these hoods coming together and affecting change through political action. And I believe, you know, that's why he was put away in the feds, where they've had him under lock and key 23-1 for 20 some odd years, can't talk to people, can't see his family, because they knew, like other black revolutionaries, black leaders that were bringing about, you know, change from the ground up, from within the streets, within the communities. When he, you know, stopped focusing on drugs and, you know, things that might have, you know, criminal activities, that was one thing. But when he reformed himself and changed Gangster Disciples to growth and development, and started 21st Century Vote and registered thousands of voters, he was becoming a political force in Chicago and in other areas here. Like, 21st Century Vote was impacting elections, and he was due out to get out on parole in the early 90s. He was going to get out, and I believe the powers that be knew that and saw him as a threat, and that's when they set him up and put him into federal prison, where he's been now, you know, at the ADX Supermax with, you know, El Chapo and the Unabomber and all these type of people. And so anyway, we're telling his story in a 10-part series. We're going to drop the trailer on his birthday, November 30th. and then we're going to release the series at the top of the year. And I think that's going to be, again, a groundbreaking series. It's so relevant to today. I mean, his story starts in the 60s, but when you look at the gun violence problem here in Chicago, the epidemic of gun violence, you will learn a lot more about why things are the way they are when you listen to this Larry Hoover story. The mainstream media doesn't tell you the whole story. They spin a whole different, way of looking at these things. So it's a story that is very, very relevant, and I think will have an enormous impact, and I hope will help him get released and get him home to his family.
That story sounds incredibly interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing it, man. So congratulations on it, Dave. If anybody is trying to get more information or subscribe or just learn more about Breakbeat, where can they follow you? Where can they get more information?
Sure. Well, so all the Breakbeat podcasts can be found on all the podcast apps, the audio versions of our podcast. So you can go on Apple, Spotify, and you'll find Don't Call Me White Girl. We have another amazing podcast that just came out called Culturati, hosted by Kieran Mayo, legendary, hip hop female journalist and executive. And then you can go to the Breakbeat Media YouTube channel. That's where the visual versions of our shows are living. And you can go to breakbeatmedia.com. The website is sort of a hub where you can see everything that we've got going on. You can follow us on socials, at Breakbeat Media on IG and Twitter. And I hope people watching this will take the time to go and check out some of the Breakbeat content. And hopefully it'll be inspiring and entertaining.
I'm sure it will be, and we'll definitely make sure we get the word out. Salute to you, Dave. Thanks so much for your time in sharing so many of these important and iconic moments in your life, man. They are definitely part of hip hop history and part of the lives of so many people in this culture. So I wish you the best in the next phase of your life. I wish you the best with Breakbeats.
Thank you, Prez, man. Really, really glad we had a chance to sit down and do this. Appreciate you, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, my brother.